Hi, welcome to a special edition of the show, a special edition we are calling The World This Year. I'm François Picard, The World This Week, in partnership with The Daily Beast. Barbie Latza-Nadeau, correspondent at large for The Daily Beast, joins us from Rome. How are you?
Great to be here.
Great to welcome you. Great to see Borzu Dargahi, international correspondent for The Independent, who's by the banks of the Bosphorus in Istanbul. Nice to see you.
Always a pleasure, Francois.
Patrick Smith, editor-in-chief of the Africa Report, was supposed to grace us with his presence here in Paris. You've crossed the channel, it seems.
Yeah, there was a Security Council meeting on the 20th of December, and it was decided that once again Europe would be isolated and the English Channel would be closed to traffic. So I had to get on the last train out of Paris. And
we'll talk more. We'll talk more about that in a moment. With us as well, Lila Jacinto, senior editor at France24.com. You've enjoyed 2020?
Oh yes, I haven't moved from this seat.
All right. Throughout the year, The World This Week on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag World This Week. More seriously, we really did not see it coming. An invisible foe, indifferent to man-made borders, the world's greatest pandemic in a century, triggering fear, anxiety, sometimes the worst in humanity, but also sometimes the best. In Italy and elsewhere, we clapped for carers who appropriately bore the name of frontline workers heading into battle. Back in the spring, they were desperately short of protective equipment, at times even sacrificing their lives, Barbie Latza-Nadeau.
That's right. You know, it's hard to think that we've come so far, but really gone nowhere, because we're right back where we started here in Italy in March. You know, we're in a total lockdown for Christmas. People are lined up outside of the grocery stores again. All the sacrifices of that first lockdown seem so optimistic over the summer, and now seems just worth nothing right now, in a certain sense.
Worth nothing right now, and without masks or enough information on what hit us. We had that first lockdown, and as families scrambled to reorganize their confined existences, in March we saw the Pope finding himself wandering a Rome devoid of humanity. And it was similar scenes, Lila Jacinto, here in Paris as well as in London and elsewhere.
Yes, and I actually did a story quite early in the first lockdown on religion and the lockdown. I feel like this pandemic was a mirror on ourselves this year. And when it comes to religion, we also saw the use of religion in some countries like India. The religious minority group, the Muslims, certainly sect of them, were targeted because they had a gathering. And it was said that, it was that gathering that exploded the number of COVID-19 cases, although they had no idea at that point. The part of religion that makes people come together as a community, which is what this virus really denied people. So, religion and COVID-19 also had a role.
Borzu Dargahi, we were stuck in place, yet we never... It was strange because we live in a digital world. We were always connected.
Yeah, I mean, we were connected. I think what was kind of extraordinary in a way was that you had this invisible menace, almost like space aliens attacking the Earth, and just how, in some ways, the kind of dysfunctions that rule our planet continued. The wars continued, maybe got even worse. The betrayals, the political machinations, the criminality. I did a story this year about a few stories about the crime networks trying to exploit COVID-19 with counterfeit masks and governments trying to make money off of COVID-19, from the White House to African nations exploiting the pandemic as a profit-seeking opportunity. It's as if humanity was attacked by aliens, and many people sided with the aliens.
Many people sided with the aliens at first. Do you think that was the case once we found our bearings?
I think they're still, in some ways, if you look at the White House, kind of handing the keys to the aliens at this point, kind of abdicating their responsibility to fight this thing and just leaving people on their own, using it as a way of, for example, blaming other countries for the pandemic instead of coming together. Yes, there has been on the ground level, on the part of frontline health workers, on the part of public health officials, leaders, certain political leaders, there has been a stepping up by them. But for many, many political leaders, many segments of society, it has shown their true colors, and it's not a pretty scene.
And this comes back to what you were alluding to, Patrick Smith, at the outset of the show. By the way, we're wondering, did you happen to see our France 24 crew at the Gare du Nord on Sunday night? I know you caught the last Eurostar out of Dodge to get back to the UK before a second closure. And I was just wondering on that point, you know, this feeling now, what's it like in the UK, this quote-unquote cancelled Christmas feeling?
Well, it's cancelled Christmas. I think it's cancelled world in the UK. I can't remember a time when London has felt more isolated. You know, it's a quirk of history that the pandemic coincides with the last few crosswords in the Brexit negotiations. So you've got the spectre of Britain crashing out of the EU without a trade deal and a global pandemic. And just ahead of the deadline for the trade deal, you've got the reality of Britain being cut off physically as well. So,
what was the mood like when you crossed over on that last train?
Yeah, well, oddly enough, it wasn't that crowded. I think the message got to people too late. A lot of people were booked to leave Paris for London on the subsequent Monday and Tuesday, and they obviously are not going to get on those trains. The trains were cancelled, so it was chaotic on both sides.
All right, that mad Christmas scramble, that chaotic Christmas scramble, pales in comparison to what India went through back in March. At the time, Prime Minister Narendra Modi suddenly announcing a lockdown, forcing migrant workers, many of them day laborers, to travel across the country to their home states. Now, Leela Jacinto, some have described this as the country's greatest migration since partition in 1947. Is that a bit of hyperbole there?
Well, I mean, they didn't cross national borders, but that's not an overestimation, because the majority of Indians are still rural, and the ones that work in the cities, in informal jobs, still have their roots in the village. And what you saw when this lockdown was announced, and it was a very tight lockdown, the Prime Minister gave the entire country 4 hours before midnight to prepare, and people in these insecure jobs in the cities realized that their only hope of survival was their villages. And, you know, in rural India is seen as a place of utter poverty that people leave in order to come to the cities. But it shows the lack of any social security, that despite all the poverty in the rural areas, all these people braved police harassment, because at least the rural areas gave them the sort of support networks that the urban centers and these precarious jobs absolutely denied them.
It's a moment when we were suddenly forced to take stock of what is globalization.
Absolutely. And what we are seeing now at the end of the year is, at least in New Delhi, you have some farmers coming back on these same roads that you saw people leaving New Delhi and all these cities for the villages. They're coming back to protest farm laws, which were passed. And this is another pattern that we've seen in this year, because under lockdown, not much scrutiny. A lot of governments have pushed through bills, through parliamentary processes that, were not properly debated. So in India, for instance, there were 3 farm laws passed, which basically the farmers feel are selling them out to corporate interests. In France, we had that too. We had a global security bill that was rushed through Parliament.
And people were out in the streets as a result.
Exactly. But at least the French government took that back.
All right. COVID sparking protest when the virus struck. Local authorities at its epicenter in Wuhan, China, played down the danger. Angry citizens demanded answers, particularly when a 33-year-old frontline doctor was detained for doubting the math. When Li Wenliang himself succumbed to COVID in early February, there was genuine outrage. A whole month would pass before China's president himself would pay his first visit to Wuhan. By year's end, Xi Jinping seemed more than ever back in control of the narrative. And Dr. Li, Barbie Latsanado, seems all but forgotten.
That's right, but there are a lot of heroes in this pandemic that have been forgotten. So many people all along the way have been eclipsed by the next big headline, essentially. We've seen it here in Italy, which was, of course, the first European epicenter. All those wonderful stories we were telling back then now seem like nothing because things got worse in the United States. I think that's just the nature of the news cycle, but it's also just human tendency to forget the good people and focus on the bad.
At the end of this year, how's China's image?
Here in Italy, Italy's had a strange relationship with China from the very beginning. They were the first European country to sign on to the New Silk Road deal. They're very interested in getting back on foot with China. I think certainly in this part of Europe, China is not seen as the bad guy as much as it is perhaps in other parts of the world.
Perhaps in other parts of the world, Patrick Smith?
I think it's very much a mixed picture. I mean, if you look at large swathes of Africa, that people like Jack Ma, the big China entrepreneur, was very quick to get his PPE and masks out across, I think, every country. 54 member states on the continent got some anti-pandemic equipment from Jack Ma. You now have the spectre going into the distribution of the vaccine. China is promising distribution of the vaccine to certain countries. I think Kenya has already taken a consignment. So I think that Xi Jinping has moved back very smartly with a kind of pandemic diplomacy on the absence of competence, both especially in terms of the Anglo-Saxon countries, Britain and the US, but also in large parts of Europe. And he's capitalizing on that, brutal as it is. It's just one of the other exaggerating effects of the pandemic, that those ideas people had before are now being exaggerated in the crucible of the pandemic.
It was just at the end of last week that China finally agreed to let the World Health Organization visit Wuhan with a team of independent experts. That's to happen in early January. The narrative on Wuhan didn't just evolve inside of China, it also evolved outside of it.
It's a disease, without question, has more names than any disease in history. I can name Kung Flu. I can name 19 different versions of names.
All right, Donald Trump's assessment of what happened, Borzo Dargahi, evolved dramatically throughout the year.
Well, I mean, I would say just in general, if we step back, I think that 2020 was the year and COVID was the crisis that really showed the bankruptcy and poverty of thinking and imagination that drives the right-wing populist surge throughout the world, not just the United States, also Brazil, for example, and other countries in Europe and the Philippines and so on. It's not just that these leaders completely botched the pandemic and put their people in harm's way because of their lack of ability and lack of skill and their bankruptcy. But there were other, democratic governments that botched it too, badly. But because of their lack of transparency, because of their, kind of serial mendacity, they also created political crises that were unnecessary. in their countries that were crises of confidence, crises of understanding. So, for example, you've had a very bad experience in like Sweden, for example, but because there is a political consensus, a genuine democracy, a technocratic process involved in making these decisions, you don't have the concomitant political crisis that you did in other countries like the United States and so on. I hope, for the sake of the planet, these, right-wing populists who also tend to question climate change as well as mishandle pandemics, they begin to fade after 2020.
Well, that brings us to that other big topic of 2020. Yes, this unprecedented pandemic weighed on an unprecedented U.S. election. We saw a record turnout, thanks in no small part to early voting campaigns that went into overdrive for health reasons. That said, the electorate was already fired up. Joe Biden and Kamala Harris winning a record number of votes, beating Donald Trump by 7 million ballots. But the Republican candidate also outperformed from 4 years ago. And it wasn't the kind of slam dunk the Democrats had hoped for, Barbie Latza-Nadeau.
That's right. When you watch these sorts of things from going on from outside your country, you really see sort of the divisiveness of the United States right now. And I think that that's what has surprised so many of us who expat Americans who live outside, but also from inside the United States, just how divided the country is. What became so apparent in this election. I think during Trump's first 4 years, only 4 years, everybody was looking at this as some sort of anomaly. But those results of the election show that it was much more than that.
And many people say that the reason Trump outperformed is because you have this system in the U.S. where your health care coverage is tied to whether or not you have a job. And Donald Trump managed to paint himself as the candidate that'll keep the economy open.
That's right. I think a lot of Americans watched the news of what was happening, especially over here in Europe with the lockdowns, the desperation of the economic situation here, and thought, we don't want that. And that's what Donald Trump promised, essentially. There will not be a lockdown under 4 more years of him. And I think people listened to that. They listened to something. I think the economy, obviously played a greater role, but I think people also were a little bit disillusioned by the choice the Democrats put up on some level.
Leila Jacinto mentioning earlier how COVID sparked protest in 2020 in the United States. Same thing with minorities disproportionately impacted by coronavirus. Pent-up rage exploded in late May over the death of 46-year-old George Floyd. His murder by white Minneapolis police caught on camera, the result of an argument over a counterfeit $20 bill. And Borzo Dargahi, you have the sense that we've seen more and more of these tragedies caught on camera, and this time it really erupted.
Yeah, 2020 was the year this issue became a global one. It was discussed all throughout the world, the issue of race relations and police brutality. There were protests, not just in the United States. There was, and not just solidarity protests. People were, using the outrage over the killing of George Floyd to raise their own issues in places like Brazil or even France, for example. But I also have to say that, what drove Trump's victory was not anything economic. His supporters are, a very bizarre coalition of people. And the thing that they include, evangelical Christians. But the thing that really drives Trump's support, and I'm sad to say this, is, white supremacy and the reaction against minority peoples and people of color and people of different gender identification and so on, speaking out and trying to come into the political process and become players in the United States. And that is really what drove Trump's support, not anything about the pandemic or anything like that. They identify with his racism and ugly kind of right-wing ideology.
You touch upon an essential point there, Borzu. This is the World This Week's first annual retrospective since the passing of Daily Beast foreign editor Christopher Dickey. Several weeks before he died in Paris of a heart attack in July, the author of books, including On the American South, connected the dots with the unresolved legacy of slavery in the U.S.
this kind of brutality goes way, way back to slavery times in the United States, but we didn't really see it in the general public until about 25 years ago, or 30 years ago now, when Rodney King was beaten in Los Angeles. And that started riots in 1991 that were horrific. But we've seen since then, we've seen again and again and again, thanks to video and then video phones, the terrible things that happen to Black people essentially just because they're Black.
Yeah, Barbie Latsanado, Christopher Dickey there speaking before there was that white supremacist shooting protesters in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and before Donald Trump deployed his equivalent of the little green men, unidentified border patrol guards, to take on demonstrators in Portland, Oregon.
That's right. So many times since Chris passed away in July, I have really wanted to discuss this with him. I mean, he really had his finger on the pulse of what is really at the core wrong with the United States. And you know, as you said, it begins with race and it ends with race. And I think, you know, Chris's words live on as absolutely on spot as usual.
In the United States, we are entering a new phase now when it comes to the race issue. We thought, remember back in 2008, some talked about a post-racial society. Now, even though the president-elect has a vice president coming in who's half African-American, half of Indian origin, no one's saying that anymore.
No, because I think what I fear is that, okay, Trump lost this election, but the absolutely systemic problems in the U.S., which, as Chris Dickey says, goes back to slavery, the electoral college system, which is a slave-era institution, will not get examined and cannot change. And we really saw this at the election time as well, with the Republicans really, not giving up the pretense of trying to allow minorities to vote. They conducted a campaign of trying to restrict the voting of Black people. So these absolutely systemic problems are not going to change by who is at the White House. The U.S. had the first Black president. That was a period of such hope. And it's not a post-racial society. I mean, Barack Obama did the best he can, but the demons are still there. And with Kamala Harris, she's also a woman. So I fear that how many people voted for Donald Trump? 70 million people? They're in the sidelines waiting to bounce up next year.
Just very briefly on this point, Borzo Dargahi, despite it all, there were a lot of African Americans and Hispanics who voted for Donald Trump.
I mean, like I said, the Trump coalition is a strange one, and it includes various right-wing factions, including, anti-revolutionary Latin American exiles, and this is key, evangelicals, very, very hardcore American Christians who include African Americans and other minorities. And I think that there's, a bit of kind of right-wing reaction in some of these minority communities, built-in misogyny that was, probably resentful of the Kamala Harris presence on the Biden ticket as well, and see in Trump a tough guy who somewhat represents their interests, or at least they like what he does. They like how he, kind of dismantles and disrupts a system that they're angry about.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier how the whole planet felt a Black Lives Matter effect. The call for better policing in Nigeria led to the End SARS movement and the promise of the disbanding of a notorious elite force. Along the way, Patrick Smith, there was that October 20th bloodbath, the shooting of peaceful protesters at Lekki Toll Plaza in Lagos.
I think that really showed the power of the movement, that it morphed very quickly from an American-based protest against police brutality against African Americans to something global. We saw it in Europe, but we saw it across in Africa. In Europe, it was a lot to do with the colonial history of Europe. So it's a parallel to the slave protests, anti-slavery protests, etc. In Africa, it was something very different. But it was some of the NSAS protesters said, look, the police in Africa are a kind of extension of the colonial inheritance. So they see the oppressive role of the police in modern-day states, independent states of Africa, is just an elongation of a kind of colonialist-type mindset. So they were taking that on with the same sort of fervor that you saw in the States.
Well,
And,
isn't it also,
Patrick,
on that point, Patrick, on that point, isn't it also just people are tired of being shaken down and they want the cops to do their job? I know the year is ending with a new hashtag, Secure the North, after the kidnapping of those boys in Katsina State. People want the police, they just want it to do their job.
Yeah, and I mean, there is some sympathy for the police and within the NSAS movement. But just to give you a figure, Nigeria's got 210 million people at least. There are about 350,000 police to police 220 million people. That's like a tenth of the UN estimates of the real requirement. And a lot of those 350,000 people are just protecting politicians. There's a feeling the police don't have the resources and the training and the means to protect people. But there's also a frustration with the brutality of particularly these special police units that are armed and have the capacity to go after people.
While they were still in the streets in Minneapolis back in June, a Justice for Adama Traoré rally unfolded outside of Paris Central Courts. Traoré, who had died in the custody of gendarmes back in 2016. Lila Jacinto, everyone here was surprised because, remember, we're just coming out of that full lockdown to see this big rally taking place in Paris.
People just braved the pandemic to come out onto the streets. And it wasn't later, it was in October when we had another case of police brutality, once again brought out, as Chris Dickey said, by footage. So all this, including George Floyd, is coming out now. And it's crossing borders. So definitely minorities and colored people are taking to the streets, but also non-minorities who are actually seeing what is happening in these banlieues and in these neighborhoods, what sort of policing is going on in cities.
And yet between June and October, the president replaced his interior minister with one who's more to the right, a former deputy chief of staff for Nicolas Sarkozy, who makes a lot of right-wing noises.
Oh, yes. And that is, everybody agrees that is a calculation that the president has made.
Or a reflection of public opinion that people want more law and order, quote unquote?
I would agree. Because I feel the overall sentiment of the country is definitely a law and order one. Although the number of protesters who came out in France shows that there is a left that is pushing against this, but I would say the tenor. The overall tenor of the country is something that the president has read. It's something that's right, center, right.
France is also finding itself reliving the dark days of 2015. Back in September 1st, for the start of the trial of the accomplices of the Charlie Hebdo massacres, the satirical weekly republished cartoons of the Prophet. That prompted a backlash in the Muslim world and fresh attacks on French soil, including a stabbing spree at Nice Cathedral and a gruesome beheading. Yeah, Samuel Paty, murdered by an 18-year-old Chechen refugee, got full state honors. He'd been the target of a Facebook campaign. He was a middle school teacher who had shown the cartoons as part of a civics class on free speech.
Samuel Paty est devenu vendredi le visage de la République, de notre volonté de briser les terroristes, de réduire les islamistes, de vivre comme une communauté de citoyens libres dans notre pays. Le visage de notre détermination à comprendre, à apprendre, à continuer d'enseigner, à être libre.
Patrick Smith, your thoughts on what led to the horrible death of this middle school teacher, which rocked France?
Well, it's what is turned into this test of Republican values in France. I have heard people in the community around the school saying that the police had actually been warned that there was likely to be some sort of attack before it happened. I think the most important thing out of this is how the society moves forward and deals with it. And you do have the attempt by Emmanuel Macron to turn this into this test of Republican values, which has obviously got a political dimension ahead of the national elections. As you say, it is regarded as a tilt to the right. But he also did say when he was elected 3 years ago that much more has to be done in the banlieue in terms of investment in social policy, in education, training programs and jobs. And I think it's this intersection of religious freedom, religious faith, Republican values and race that is going to be so difficult for the government to manage. So I think it's escalating into a much wider political crisis, and which isn't helped, obviously, by the economic distress caused by the coronavirus.
Yeah, this test of Republican values is more than a test. It's became a draft bill, the draft bill which includes a lot of measures to contain or counter radical Islam. One of them, Borzu Daragahi, is try to phase out foreign imams. And I know that has angered Turkey's president. What's angered people in Turkey more? Is it this phasing out of the foreign imams that's been announced, or again, the republishing of those cartoons in the name of free speech?
Well, I mean, the president here, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, has tried to exploit this issue as he tries to whip up his base and get people to support his political party and so on, and kind of feed some red meat to to his right flank. But you would be surprised at how small of a blip it has made in the general public, even among supporters of Erdogan's Justice and Development Party. I think that what is more essential, though, is on the part of France to deal with this horrific crime, and to deal with the fact that this ideology has taken root on French soil, this mentality. The perpetrator was someone who had lived in France pretty much all of his life. And I know that there is an attempt by France to sort of externalize this issue. This is an outsider thing coming into our country, and we have to, no, that's not going to work. It's not going to work that way. He was radicalized in France. What is it about growing up Muslim in France that is causing this very small number of people to lash out in this horrific way? And I think that is the danger, is that they try to dump all this stuff on Erdogan or Salafis or whatever, the Muslim Brotherhood, take up all these talking points from the United Arab Emirates and its de facto leader Mohammed bin Zayed, who is whispering into the ear of Macron and the foreign secretary, and not deal with the social issues at hand for France.
Barbie Latza-Nadeau. Yeah, there was that attack. There was the stabbing spree in Nice, where it was a different case because he'd come from Tunisia through Italy. What's the view on France once again grappling with its notion of secularism and with radical Islam?
Well, I think a lot of countries in Europe are very quick to point to this as a French problem and a problem that doesn't exist in other places. But as you mentioned, a lot of people come into France through Italy on the migration trail and things like that. The system is broken in terms of how people are radicalized in France, for example, but also the system is broken into how people are entering into Europe that can potentially be part of this greater radicalization. I think Europe likes to point fingers at each other when there's a problem. And we see this, I think, time and time again. But certainly, this is not just a French problem. This is a European problem that just happens to be happening in France right now more than other places.
Lila Jacinto, final word on this. Again, it's nearly 6 years after the Paris attacks at Charlie Hebdo. At the time, you remember 6 years ago, we talked about le vivre ensemble was the word in French, the living, I don't know how you translate that, living together,
Yep.
how to better understand each other. The best way to counter radicalism is through dialogue. What's happened to that?
Well, this year there was the trial of the Charlie Hebdo attacks, and all these issues came together 5 years after those trials because of Samuel Paty's horrific beheading. And you're absolutely right. These Prophet Muhammad cartoons were published in 2005. This is a 15-year problem. But the fact that this issue still comes up and Islamists or Islamist presidents can bring it up and rile up parts of the Muslim world, because we saw a boycott in some parts of the Muslim world of French products. It goes to show that France also needs to manage this problem. On the one hand, I disagree with Borzou on the perpetrators of these attacks, because unlike the 2015 attacks, which were French people brought up in France, the Nice attack was a Tunisian who had really just been in France for a few years, and the person who
the killer of Samuel Paty had lived in France since he was 6.
This is true, but he was also a Chechen refugee. The security forces were alerted about the person who put this on the digital platform. And what I fear is we've got another bill coming up, a tightening of the digital radicalization, which is also very important. But then what do you do when people like Erdogan or Ayatollah Khomeini, who started the Rushdie affair, they also perpetrate this message? So I feel that there needs to be a balancing of what the values of liberty are, but also a sort of an acknowledgement of certain sentiments can be hurt. And that balance is a fine one, a diplomatic balance that needs to be done.
All right, a war of words with Emmanuel Macron was the least of it in 2020 for Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who flexed quite a bit of muscle on the world stage, deploying troops to Libya, gunboats to the oil and gas-rich waters of the eastern Mediterranean, and going all in on the winning side in the disputed enclave of Nagorno-Karabakh, backing Azerbaijan as it retook territory from Armenia. It all ended with Russia stepping in as truce broker and retreating ethnic Armenians burning down their own homes before leaving. This has been going on, Borzou Dargahi, since before the breakup of the Soviet Union between Azerbaijan and Armenia over Nagorno-Karabakh.
Going on for a century.
And do you have the feeling that it's going to go on longer, or has Turkey changed the game for good?
Well, in terms of the Caucasus, I think that that is a sort of a separate battleground at this point from other ones, from Turkey's other kind of foreign adventures. This was a unresolved, frozen conflict since the end of the Soviet Union. And, at that time, Azerbaijan was a poor backwater. And right now, Azerbaijan is this wealthy country with a lot of weapons. They wanted to renegotiate the terms of the truce that was settled in the early 90s. They couldn't do it via diplomacy in the Minsk process. They did it on the battlefield. But as far as Turkey goes, yes, Turkey is becoming a more and more bolder power, more willing to use military means to achieve its political and diplomatic objectives in sort of far-flung places. That has put it in conflict with other Western powers, as well as, for example, Russia. And it's emerging as sort of a bit of a regional superpower and challenging other regional superpowers, such as Saudi Arabia in a way, and the United Arab Emirates. So, and that is creating a lot of friction as Turkey seeks to redraw certain rules in this part of the world.
And it's interesting because we're talking, it's the 10th anniversary of the Arab Spring. At the time, Erdogan was this shining example of how you can marry religion and reformist politics. A lot has happened inside of the country since. What is the street cred of Erdogan right now?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. If you look at the polls, he is, not doing so well. His, popularity is down, and in a theoretical matchup with both the mayors of Istanbul and Ankara, he is slightly behind. Interestingly enough, I think that is because of the economy and the economic problems caused by COVID and the mismanagement of the issue of inflation and currency and so on. But his moves, remarkably, his moves, for example, in the Eastern Mediterranean, in Azerbaijan, not so much in Libya, but in other theaters, are incredibly popular with the people who otherwise oppose him. His brand of Turkish nationalism sells even to those, liberals, so-called liberals and nationalists that the West seems to prefer over his Islamist-leaning political party.
Jacinto?
No, obviously. What we saw this year is, once again, the problems back home. There was flag raising in many countries. China had that a lot, because China faced a lot of questions about how this pandemic, how the outbreak was initially handled. They did a mask diplomacy, but China was very aggressive this year on all its border, on the South China Sea, in Hong Kong, on the Indian border. So this rallying around the flag is which happened in a U.S. election here, so sort of not really under the international spotlight. And in the South Caucasus, Turkey is a major player now. Erdogan is even, because the three main powers in this region are Turkey, Iran, and Russia. And the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict has really put the U.S. and France out of the picture. Erdogan is now flexing his muscles with Iran. I don't know what his end game is, but this year saw Turkish power really rise up to the fore, and he's managing his problems with Russia.
Finally, before we go, it was a year bookended by the premature departure of two sporting legends. The Los Angeles Lakers' Kobe Bryant dying in a helicopter crash at the start of 2020, and Diego Armando Maradona, the man who single-handedly, pardon the pun, beat England and led Argentina on its winning run at the 1986 World Cup. Maradona was 60. They're still mourning him in Argentina, of course, but also on this side of the Atlantic, nowhere more so, Barbie Latza-Nadeau, than Naples.
That's right. The official renaming of the football stadium in Naples has taken place. The murals have gone up all over the city. The city is in mourning. It's really poignant, I think, that, as you said, that these two superstars bookended this horrific year when so many people need sports. So many people look to sports as not only a diversion, but a sort of a religion, something to focus on, something to think about that brings a little bit more joy than I think we've seen in this horrific 2020.
Patrick Smith, in Maradona, are people mourning the death of the bad boy we all love to love because he was a footballing genius who sometimes would get caught for doping or have issues, if you will, off the field? Or is it, just simply because we're saying goodbye to really an era?
Well, it's an era at football at its sort of breathtaking peak. You had this kid who grew up in the toughest possible circumstances, having to fetch water for his family in the beginning of the day and so forth, becoming this international legend just around the world. It was one of those things we all were desperate, I think, in this pandemic year to sort of rally around global symbols of excellence. And Maradona just personified that. Sure, the bad boy image, people forgave him that to a great extent. But you've only got to look in the bookshops around the world. In Paris, there's a sort of 300-page color supplement all about Maradona, and it's selling off the shelves. He was an incredibly popular figure. There's no question about it. On the sort of Muhammad Ali type level, I guess, and for the same reasons, people sort of rallied around the story behind the guy.
All right, and we're in desperate need, I think, of uplifting tales in 2021. I want to thank you so much, Patrick Smith, for joining us from London, Borzu Daragahi in Istanbul, Barbie Latza-Nadeau in Rome, Lila Jacinto. Thank you for joining us here for the world this year.